Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Streets of Rage 3, also known as Bare Knuckle 3, for a lot of different systems, but it was originally on the Genesis. This is a side-scrolling beat-em-up by Sega and the sequel to Streets of Rage 2. It was released in 1994 for the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive, depending on your region, and later saw a release across a lot of different systems, included in numerous collections, that sort of thing. And it's worth noting that region actually does make a pretty big difference in this game. Specifically, Japanese versus West. The Western version of the game is pretty wildly different from the original Japanese version in certain respects. And it changes things from simple cosmetic things like the sprites for the main characters having different color outfits. For example, Axel's no longer wearing a white shirt, he's wearing a yellow shirt for some reason. And Blaze isn't wearing red anymore, she's wearing white for some reason. Things like that. All the way up to outright removing content from the original Japanese version, like Ash, who was a sub-boss and was a flamboyantly gay stereotype. And if you think I'm making that up, well, no, I'm really not. There actually was a flamboyantly gay sub-boss in the original Japanese version. He's actually unlockable as a playable character if you use a cheat code too, and that they kept that in the Western release, which I don't know why they did, but oh well. There were other issues too. They censored some of the sprites, like the female characters, which no longer have quite as revealing outfits, which is incredibly amusing to me, considering it was apparently perfectly fine in the previous two games, but once you get to this, no, can't do that. Now they're wearing jackets that obscure the fact that they're pretty much wearing dominatrix outfits. Why? If it was fine in the first two games, why isn't it fine here? Ugh. Porting games to the West doesn't make sense all the time. So, right off the bat, you can tell that the Western release of the game is technically inferior to the original Japanese version. It just has less in it. It has things censored for no particular reason, and when you get to more important parts of the game, it actually becomes a pretty big detriment. I mean, you can live with things like sprite color swaps, or changing the voice clips from things like Axel saying Grand Upper to the rather dumb-sounding Bare Knuckle. Things like that are perfectly tolerable, I should say. Whereas removing content from the game altogether and wildly altering the story the way they did, not so much. So that of course begs the question, did all these changes result in a better game, or did they just remove content and censor things for the sake of censoring for the Western audience that they thought couldn't handle it, or what went on there? And more importantly, how does this stack up to the previous two games? Because if you've seen my review of Streets of Rage 2 in particular, you know that the first two games are two of the best beat-em-ups ever made, with the sequel being pretty much the best beat-em-up ever made. At least as far as I've played. So, how does Streets of Rage 3 stack up? Well, as far as the presentation goes, they did make some pretty good changes here and there. Namely in regards to the visual quality. The sprite work is generally more detailed than the previous games, and the animations are smoother, more fluid. Environments generally have a bit more detail to them. That said, the color palette is a bit more dark and grungy than the previous two games. A bit more anyway. It's not wildly different, it's still a pretty bright and colorful game for the most part, but you do notice it. And they did do their best to add in some new enemy types and made them pretty easily recognizable, pretty detailed, that sort of thing. But again, there's that really nasty black mark on this thing for having been censored, and this goes beyond what they did in Streets of Rage 2. In Streets of Rage 2, if you're not aware, and I can't believe I didn't mention this in my review, the North American version has, as far as I'm aware, it's only one sprite that was changed, and that was during Blaze's jump kick. In the Japanese and European versions, there's a panty shot in that. But in the North American release, they edited it so you don't see the panties. That's it. And nobody even gives a crap about that, because, really, who would give a crap about that? But then you get to this, and the changes just don't make any sense. That's really my main issue with this thing. The changes that they made that censor the game, not only in North America, but also the European version as well, they're identical, actually. The changes don't make any sense. Now, removing Ash, the gay stereotype character, is one thing. They didn't want to offend people, I guess, and I can see where that could be a pretty offensive character. Except for the fact that this game is obviously not meant to be taken seriously because the Western plot is completely bonkers, and the game actually features as one of the sub-bosses a frickin' kangaroo with boxing gloves. This is the game where Streets of Rage completely jumped the shark and makes no sense. And so all of the changes that they made in the Western release make even less sense. You're not supposed to take this thing seriously. And things that were perfectly fine in the previous two games are suddenly not okay? What? It just baffles me why they did this. And it wasn't just the North American release. That's even more baffling. But that aside, the rest of the presentation has issues too. The sound effects are mostly fine. They're pretty much exactly how they were in Streets of Rage 2. But the music is horrible. It's still Yuzo Koshiro, but this time around he went more for the experimental kind of thing and ended up with a lot of noise-based music. And it's terrible. It's like nails on a chalkboard for me. And some people like it. I don't know how, but some people like it. But it's just a bunch of discordant noise that doesn't really fit in with the previous two games at all. Instead of feeling like dance music, it just feels like obnoxious crap. And so you have that assaulting your ears at all times. You have the just baffling visual changes that are not just related to the provocative stuff like mini skirts, woo, or dominatrix outfits, woo. No, they censor violent imagery too, and that's in basically the ending and such. It's just baffling that they made as many weird changes as they did to this thing, and yet still managed to improve at least some of the visuals. But honestly, it's not the changes in the visuals or the sound design that really bother me the most. What really bothered me is what they changed in the story, in particular. You see, in the original Japanese release, the plot was that Dr. Zan, who is one of the playable characters, had actually developed some sort of new explosive kind of thing, and Mr. X was going to use that to start a global war. And so you're basically trying to stop him after that. Meanwhile, in the American and European versions, Mr. X has created a research company in order to make lifelike robots that will replace people. And after he replaces people, he's going to suddenly run the city. I wish I was making this crap up. The plot makes no sense in the Western version. At all. You just go through it, and it actually has cutscenes this time around. Or at least sort of. They're really just still images with text overlay that pops up for what the characters are saying. But it has it. And it has multiple endings, depending on how you actually do in-game. One of them's a good ending, and one of them's a bad ending, and you got a couple of neutral endings as well. There is, of course, a pretty major problem with that, at least as far as the Western version is concerned. I can't speak from experience on the Japanese version, but in the Western version, all of those endings are pretty terrible. They're stupid, and they don't make a lot of sense. So you end up going, well, okay, whatever. What about the gameplay, though? Because, I mean, it's a beat-em-up game. You don't really care too much about the story, even though they kind of try to shove it down your throat. At least you can skip cutscenes and such. But really, when it comes to a beat-em-up game, the gameplay is what really counts. Well, they did make some improvements to the previous game. For one, instead of your super attacks, like the Kikisho, if you're playing as Blaze, instead of those using your health bar, they only use your health bar if they're not charged up. If they're charged up, you have a meter that builds up, If they're charged up, then you actually don't take any damage. If they aren't fully charged up, then you do take some damage. And it resets your meter. So that adds a bit more flexibility. That said, they also made them weaker. In fact, pretty much all of your attacks are weaker, regardless of who you're playing. And a lot of them are much less useful. For example, if you're playing as Skate, instead of doing the jump spiral kick that he did if you pressed the special button, the A button in Streets of Rage 2, he now just rolls forward and flails around like an idiot. It's considerably less useful, and does considerably less damage. The other characters have the same stuff, but then there's Dr. Zan, who is the new character, and who is big and slow and lumbering, and is supposed to hit hard, I guess, but he kinda doesn't. And his attacks are kinda useless too. In fact, I absolutely despise playing as Dr. Zan. He's just infuriating to play. Unlike, say, Max in the previous game, who was incredibly powerful despite being slow and not really having a lot of agility or anything, he doesn't really have anything. See, he's a cyborg, which means you would think that he would have some pretty cool stuff. And about the only cool thing he has is whenever he picks up a weapon, instead of actually using the weapon, he sticks it into his arm and now has this sort of energy ball thing that he can throw at enemies. That's kinda it. Whereas Max was pretty tough and actually kinda useful. I just find that playing as Dr. Zan is an incredibly frustrating experience, because you'll just go into a level and you'll get your ass handed to you because he's slow and lumbering and very easy to hit, and he doesn't really have anything to compensate for that. He's supposed to do the most damage out of all the characters, but he really doesn't. At least it doesn't feel that way. And before you start talking about lowering the difficulty, I'm only playing this thing on normal, which is what I played the other Streets of Rage games on. In fact, I can play the previous games on higher difficulties, because they're challenging, but they're not BS like this game is. This thing has a nasty habit of throwing a lot of gauntlets at you, where there's just tons and tons of enemies on screen at once, and you have to deal with all of them, and they're much faster than they were in previous games. They're more agile, they run around your attacks more. There's more enemies that have fairly long range attacks. In fact, there's guys with guns in particular, and they get infuriating because you're trying to deal with other guys, and then these guys are trying to pick you off from a mile away, basically. And you have just incredibly annoying sub-bosses, you have incredibly annoying level bosses, some of which are just incredibly cheap. It's ridiculous. It's like they made the game specifically to be as infuriating as possible, and I don't understand it. It's just such a wildly different feel from the previous two games, despite having pretty much the same style of gameplay as far as moves and things like that. I mean, you do have some of those changes that I mentioned already. You have the changes to things like the special attacks being able to be powered up, where you can tap a button on the 6-button controller. That's something else they added in support for, and you'll do a more powerful version of that, which will be reset if you lose a life, of course. And they just intersperse less healing items in the levels. They intersperse less items in general in the levels. The levels are much, much longer than they were in the previous game, so they just feel like they drag on and on and on. It's just a mess. And what should be an incredibly fun beat-em-up game is just infuriating to play. I can't stand playing this thing, which boggles my mind. It's a Streets of Rage game. I should be enjoying the living hell out of it, but I just can't. There's too many problems here, and when I say Streets of Rage 2 is the best in the series, it really is. This thing was such a massive step downwards compared to that it's not even worth bothering with. The only reason I can think to recommend it to anybody is if you're a truly die-hard Streets of Rage fan and you have to own the rest of the games in the series, or if you're a masochist, or if you just get it in a package deal. Otherwise, I say avoid it. Thanks for watching.